Hi and welcome everybody. I am Amy Clarke. I am the co-founder of Tribe Impact Capital, and I am also one of the global steering group members of GEFI, the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, which is a not-for-profit based in Scotland with a huge and growing global reach. GEFI is committed to ensuring that finance plays a better role in serving people and planet. And following our successful path to COP28 partnership, we're absolutely delighted to once again be teaming up with the Asset TV team for our 2024 GEFI Insights series. Now, the series is being delivered with our knowledge partners, the Carbon Tracker Initiative and Planet Tracker, both of whom aim to highlight the risk and opportunity for investors on the path to a low carbon and nature positive future. So we're really delighted to be partnering with them. Now, today's discussion will kick off the series by exploring the climate-nature nexus, which is crucial for the financial sector to identify where the climate and nature-related risks and opportunities overlap or diverge. Richard, Nicole, John, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Rather than me introduce you, I'm going to ask you all just to introduce yourselves very, very briefly and your role in either the climate finance or nature finance arena. Richard, I'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Amy. And we're delighted to be partnering with GEFI at Carbon Tracker. So I head policy and engagement for Carbon Tracker Initiative. We're a think tank research organisation. Our vision is a decarbonised global economy. How do we want to get there? That's by accelerating the energy transition through mobilising capital markets. So against that background, our audience is very much finance and investment, but also we take a major interest in what's going on in the policy world as well. And I lead for Carbon Tracker on that whole area.
Marvellous. Thanks, Richard. Nicole.
Thanks, Amy, and delighted to be here and to be partnering with GEFI and with Carbon Tracker on this initiative. My name is Nicole Kosowski. I'm the head of engagement at the sustainable finance think tank Planet Tracker. We focus our research on the drivers of biodiversity loss. So we're looking at nature risks and opportunities, and similar to Carbon Tracker, focusing on the finance sector. So helping the finance sector identify how to take nature into account. In my capacity as Planet Tracker, I lead the engagements with the financial institutions and advise them on these issues.
Wonderful. Thanks, Nicole. And John.
Hi, Amy. My name's John Cross. I'm a sustainable investment specialist and climate lead at Mercer in their investment consulting business. As part of that role, we're looking to integrate the latest scientific and industry developments in the area of climate change into the advice that we give our institutional investor client base. And given climate change is a key driver of nature loss, and given biodiversity conservation is a key enabler of climate action, that work, those discussions with our clients is increasingly looking at where climate and nature can be considered in parallel.
That's a really important point that you've made there around the intersectionality and the nexus between the two, and we'll certainly come on to that later. Richard, I want to come to you because we've heard an awful lot over the last couple of years from the finance sector with regards to climate finance. Where are we really?
Well, I guess the ultimate test would be defined by the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1.c for the nerds amongst us. But I mean, that's about making financial flows consistent with pathways to low emissions. Now, on the upside, I think we could point to the International Energy Agency. They calculated that there was a record investment last year in the clean energy economy, and that was $1.8 trillion. But also, I think the point really to underline on the upside there, I mean, this is not about ESG. This is about real money and investment going into that clean energy economy. Also, I think we can point to how climate change is being mainstreamed in the boardrooms as well of financial institutions who see it as increasingly material. I think carbon pricing is a good example of that. But I think also we would say there's still so much more to do, especially in the face of climate science, escalating warming and extreme weather events. 3 points briefly on that, I think. First, that we are seeing too much greenwashing still by financial institutions, where frankly their actions are not matching their promises on climate change. And Carbon Tracker, we've done quite a lot of work on that, looking at what financial institutions are doing. Also, that the short-term view being still too prevalent, really, as opposed to financial institutions thinking about the longer term implications of climate. What the rise of renewables, of electric vehicles mean in terms of the impact of demand for the fossil fuel economy, and also a message that Carbon Tracker has consistently emphasised for a long time now, the risk of stranded assets for investors as well. I think my final point is to bringing the global south dimension as well, the challenge of climate and the transition for developing economies, and the real concerns there still about the huge scaling up of investment required if developing economies are both going to be able to address adaptation needs, but also actually to meet the challenges of the transition.
It's a really important point, that I think when we think about the flow of capital into the global south, but how much of it is sticky, how much is staying there, and how much is then being extracted back out as well. Nicole, there's been huge developments in climate, and it's probably fair to say that climate finance is further ahead of nature finance. But where are we currently with nature finance?
Yes, so we've seen an acceleration in nature finance. And if businesses are to transition, they need to transform their business operations and they need to transform their value chains. So they need capital for that. The UN has actually published a report at the end of last year looking at the state of nature finance. And I think there's some interesting insights that we can draw from that. If we look at the private sector, currently the private sector is investing around $35 billion every year into nature positive investments, but it's quite low compared to the $5 trillion that they're investing into nature negative investments every single year. I think what's also interesting to look at is what is it being invested into? Because there is a skew towards nature conservation and restoration of critical biomes. Roughly half of that amount is being invested into these two activities. And both of these activities are incredibly important to invest into. However, we also need to have investment into the business operations and into these supply chains. And then if we look into the public sector, the picture is fairly similar. Currently, there's roughly kind of 10 times the investment into environmentally harmful activities compared to nature-based solutions. And if we are to achieve the Rio targets, we need to scale it from the current $200 billion that are being invested to almost 3 times that by 2030 to roughly $540 billion. So overall, yes, there is movement, but we need to scale investments. We need to turn around environmentally harmful subsidies. And we also need to focus our investments into the real economy.
Thanks, Nicole. John, you mentioned this earlier, obviously the nexus between climate finance and nature finance, and the fact that they're two sides of the same coin because of that interdependency and the deep relationships between the two. You work with institutional investors around the world, advising them, supporting them. Are you seeing more of the conversation now joining those two dots, or is it still quite compartmentalized?
I think financial institutions are seeing it more and more in parallel. I think from a risk perspective, financial institutions are increasingly aware of the potential impacts of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis on their operations, on their investments, on their overall financial stability. 5 out of the top 10 most severe risks over the next 10 years, and I think this speaks to your point around short-term versus long-term, is actually environmentally related when you look at the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report. Extreme weather events comes in at number 1. Biodiversity loss comes in at number 3. So sort of an awareness of those risks and the sort of the interactions is certainly there. I think on the opportunity side, I think the example of natural capital solutions that you mentioned, I think that very much is increasing in awareness. So those measures to protect, manage and restore natural ecosystems. The science says that up to sort of a third of the mitigation required under the Paris Agreement could be delivered through these types of solutions. So sort of a third of the emissions reductions that we need. So again, on the opportunity side, there's this link. So I think in addition to this understanding, I think quantification is improving as well, thanks to initiatives like Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, which now sits under the International Sustainability Standards Board. And I think also on the nature side, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which released its recommendations last year. And I think we are seeing adoption of those recommendations, both by companies and by financial institutions as well. That's helping make more informed investment decisions through capital allocation and through the way they engage with the companies they invest in and the projects they invest in as well. So certainly growing awareness, both the risks, both the opportunities, and how that links to investment decisions as well. The plumbing's there.
Fantastic. That's really reassuring to hear. If I come back to something that Richard mentioned earlier around climate finance and the fact that more of that is now happening at the board level, with what you've just discussed and the increasing occurrence of a more integrated narrative in these FIs around the world, at what level is that happening, in your experience within the organisation?
I think at Mercer, when we're talking to sort of UK pension schemes, we're talking to the chair of trustees, often taking responsibility, making sure that these types of discussions are on the agenda. When we're talking to large asset owners around the world with in-house teams, you're looking at sort of escalated above the sustainability function. You're looking at the financial officers, you're looking at the CEOs, again, sort of leading the charge on some of these topics. So very much, I think, increasing and sort of elevating away from a sustainability function into those C-suite levels.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to come to Richard and Nicole now, just on, again, that sort of the intersectionality, the partnership between those two. And if we think about the policy kind of environment that has been at play now for decades, specifically that within the UN. So thinking about the Convention of Parties we have for the climate and the Convention of Parties that we have for biodiversity, what level of integration are we now starting to see between those? What have been, I think, historically, and they certainly have appeared to the outside audience to be quite historically separate. Where's the intersection happening there?
Yeah, I think a lot has happened over the last few decades because, as you just mentioned, they were formed separately under the Rio Convention. And back in the day, it was seen that these issues were kind of too big to tackle all together, which is why they were kind of divided up. And there was a third one on land degradation and desertification, actually. But even back then, scientists have kind of highlighted the interdependence between climate and nature. And over the last few decades, we kind of seen them merge together. And there's some very concrete examples that you can look at. So for instance, there have been specific technical working groups that have been set up to make sure that both the UNFCCC and the CBD are working together and are tackling the same issues. Same with the kind of science, the science divisions of both of these organizations, the IPCC and the IPBES, have also joined working groups where they tackle these issues at the same time. If you look to Glasgow or also to Dubai, there's been specific efforts to mention kind of forest loss or have a specific food day. We've seen a lot of focus on oceans, on nature-based solutions. So we definitely see evidence that it is coming closer together. And if you look at the Biodiversity Cup specifically, I think one thing to keep in mind is that if we talk about nature loss and the drivers of biodiversity loss, climate change is a key driver of biodiversity loss. It's one of the 5 drivers. So it is inherently integrated into the process. And we see that also with the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted 2 years ago in Montreal, that climate change has a very prominent place there, that the emissions are being addressed. So I would say we're seeing kind of more and more convergence. But Richard, you might have some thoughts on that.
I would very much endorse what Nicole has just said. I think there's 2 points I'd bring out. One, actually, you talked about interdependence, between the climate and the nature agendas. And we saw that specifically, I think you mentioned this at the outset as well, Amy, in the last IPCC report last year, the AR6 report, I think it was, where the climate scientists talked about this independence between climate change and the impact on nature. So I think that's one point. I think the second, sort of going back to your question, is they developed on differing tracks, and there was a view that saw climate change being the prominent, the first among equals of the environmental issues, which is understandable. But it is really quite striking now. We saw this in Glasgow, and we saw this, a number of us who were out in Dubai, where we saw for the first time, I think there was a food day there at a climate change COP. So yeah, no, I would very much agree. Can I just pick up one of the point that John made earlier, which was about the disclosure, reporting and disclosure agenda you talked about, John, the TCFD, the TNFD with the acronyms on climate and nature related financial disclosures. Yes, I mean that those have been really positive developments. I think just one sort of caveat we would make is that we worry sometimes whether we're talking about financial institutions, if we're talking about corporates, can hide too much behind this. And actually, what are you doing in terms of actually tackling climate change, decarbonisation in the real world?
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Richard. And I think on that point as well, there's a bigger conversation, not for today, but around double materiality as well, and how these frameworks encourage, or not, as the case may be, companies to be able to articulate the risks that they're facing as much as the risks that they're creating for everybody else as well. And I think that's a really, really important point. But as I said, that's probably a 2 or 3 hour conversation in and of itself. John, I want to come back to you because obviously, you've got firsthand experience of working in the system, with financial institutions, with institutional investors, specifically, and you've been doing it for a long time now. Have you seen shifts in how the system, the finance system more generally, is engaging with these COPs and these kind of work streams that are going on?
I think it's certainly the case in terms of there is support for these respective COPs and the goals and the targets that come from them. I think in terms of climate, we mentioned the Paris Agreement, COP21, that's increasingly being reflected in the investment strategies of institutional investors. At Mercer, we believe that a successful transition is an imperative for long-term investors. And that's because the alternative, a failed transition, the physical damages associated, that's going to lead to sort of long-term negative portfolio-wide impacts. And many of our clients are using findings like that to support adoption of net zero targets that are in line with the Paris Agreement. I think on nature, again, so you mentioned the Global Biodiversity Framework. I think that's often seen as sort of the nature equivalent of the Paris Agreement. But the 23 targets to 2030 and the 4 goals out to 2050, reflecting that in strategies is definitely a work in progress, partly reflecting the fact that came out at the end of 2022. But given every single pathway to achieving the Paris Agreement involves protecting forests and sustainable use of natural ecosystems as part of institutional investors' net zero plans, nature is increasingly coming in there. So I think there's support in terms of action. I think exactly as you said, more needs to be done. At COP28, whilst there was progress, it fell short of what the science was demanding in terms of urgency and ambition to keep a 1.5 degree window possible. Admittedly, perhaps with overshoot. And I think mirroring that in the financial world, there does remain significant financing gaps in the area of financing net zero, in the area of adaptation, in particular in emerging markets, and also in terms of biodiversity loss as well. And those gaps exist in spite of commitments. The Glasgow Financial Alliance on net zero, it's $100 trillion plus of capital that's committed to supporting a transition to a net zero economy, but actually deploying that capital at the scale that's required. That remains really the challenge that many in the industry are trying to solve. So support, yes. Action, yes, but more to be done.
It's a really important point that you've just raised there, John, because there is inertia in the system. And we have to understand why there's inertia in the system when the capital is there to move to where we need to move to. In your experience, what do you think is one of the most material contributors to that inertia?
That's a good question. I think. Well, let me put it this way: the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, they I think last couple of weeks put out their fourth target setting protocol, and one of the things they talked about, these are large asset owners who support a net zero outcome, and one of the things they talk about there is economic room for maneuver. There's assets they want to deploy, but they need to ensure that they are delivering the returns they need to in respect of their fiduciary duties and elsewhere. So there is a policy angle, there is a collective angle around this, but I think that's an important one to address to support asset owners to then deploy that capital.
There's a big question, and don't worry because I'm not going to ask this of you, but there is a big question as well as to whether our leaders have the right skills to be able to navigate what is an increasingly complex landscape in a system that is in some ways largely linear and quite binary. We're now being asked to make decisions that references a system that is multidimensional, multifaceted, non-linear, invisible in parts, tangible in others as well. And the question, therefore, is do we have the right skill sets in finance to be able to make the right kind of decisions? And this is why the Global Ethical Finance Initiative is such an important space for people to come, because we do have the bankers, the financiers, the ecologists, the environmentalists, the activists. GEFI's creating this space to enable everybody to come and co-create and learn from each other. And I think it's such an important, I often refer to it as a sanctuary for people to come together and find out what works as well. But there is a big question around whether or not we have the right skill sets and how do we get them if we don't. Richard?
Yeah, I think you make a really good point there. It's about the whole ecosystem, isn't it, so to speak? And one of the major challenges, if we're coming back to finance and financing the transition, it seems to me, is that we need new thinking and we need innovation in finance. So, if we're talking about where the new sources of finance are going to come from on the public side to mobilize private investment in the transition. And that's where you need that as the different disciplines you just talked about, to actually come together, because ultimately we've all got a stake in this.
Yes.
So to work together so that, excuse the cliche, the whole is the same of the sum is whole. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Sorry. And I would apply the same to government as well. That
Absolutely.
You need that whole of government approach as opposed to it being siloed.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we're all in the same swimming pool. Yeah. We've got to get out of our lanes and potentially explore a little bit more. Anyway, 60 seconds. Question to you all: when you look out for the next kind of 12 to 18 months, say, what's exciting you the most? What are you feeling most optimistic about?
Okay, let me. I think, Amy, that if you look at the approach that the UN is taking, and also the COP presidencies, and this is on the climate side more, but then sort of bringing in nature, as we were talking about as well. It's a sort of longer term approach, looking out to actually the COP in Brazil. In November 2025, because during that period, a new raft of NDCs, emissions reduction plans, really important. And I think the final point within this as well, excited, is about what the UN have put into process about what they're calling the National Collective Quantified Goal, which is a bit of a mouthful, on finance, and where governments are going to be reporting back at the COP this year in Baku. And if we can see some real movement forward on that, that is something to be excited about for tackling the transition.
Absolutely. Nicole, I'm unfairly come to you next.
I think on the nature finance side, it must be the COP this year, the biodiversity COP. So as I mentioned, we had the GBF being implemented 2 years ago. Now it's really about, the implementation of the targets and the operationalization of it. So to your point, John, about, how can finance help? We need some precise steps as to what to do next. This is what this COP will be about. So I'm quite excited to see what will come out of it. At the same time, I think there's a lot of tools and frameworks and other things available already also for their financial markets to use. So I'm hoping that over the next 12 to 18 months, you've mentioned the TNFD, for instance, but there's others that are also supporting this, that financial institutions will start to look into their dependencies and the interdependencies with nature. What are the risks, but also what are the opportunities? I think there is something to be excited about to invest into that space. And then maybe just lastly to the corporates, we also need more kind of transparency and traceability. And we see more and more financial institutions, public actors, civil society asking for that. So we can see some credible pathways and some ambitious targets that are being set.
Brilliant. Thank you, John.
So I think for me, what I'm most excited about is those financing gaps and starting to make headway in those. And they're not going to solve that in a year, in the 12 months, but sort of every little helps. And I think sort of closer to home in the way that we invest, in the way that we advise investors, it's investors starting to set target allocations to climate and nature based solutions, really starting to really explicitly make allocations there. That will help build the demand signals for projects, for companies to sort of essentially produce investment products that generate those returns, but at the same time is meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, is meeting the goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework as well. So that's for me over the next 12 months.
Fantastic. And if I just ask myself the same question, there was a not widely reported initiative that came out of COP28, and it was France and I think it was Kenya. I might be wrong here, but looking at taxation, and taxation within the financial services kind of sector. And reading between the lines, and actually, Rich, is quite interesting. Reading between the lines, there was almost the inference of a taxation on transactions within the finance system that potentially have negative consequences as well. Now, we don't know what that means. It's being worked on at the moment. What it could look like, whether it is for, specific asset classes, whether it's actually more geared towards sovereigns, whatever. But there was that little tease that came out of COP28 that wasn't very widely reported, that I think a number of people kind of zeroed in and went, oh, now that could be very, very interesting depending on where it goes. And it is decked effectively for the next kind of 12 months in terms of further meat on the bones, looking at what that would look like. So that to me is something that I'm going to be keeping a close eye on, because I think that could, depending on what it is and what they mean, could be transformational in increasing the flow of capital quite quickly as well, depending on how it's executed.
And just in a political sense, global North and global South working together.
Yes, absolutely.
In terms of, helping to repair some of the trust which has been eroded really over time.
Yes.
On finance.
Gosh, well, Richard, Nicole, John, there's an awful lot. I mean, we've only probably done a tiny amount of justice to a very, very large, I think, topic that we could probably have spent hours talking about. But I think some of the key takeaways, there is an increasing conversation happening out in the marketplace now around climate and nature, and being two sides of the same coin. You can't tackle one without tackling the other because of those deep relationships. And that's something to be embraced and nurtured, something for us all to kind of invest further in. That there are some silver linings that we can look out to as well in the future. The COP in Brazil, the COP this year as well, or the COPs plural this year. Although I think there are some question marks over the finance COP later this year. But there are still some bright things for us to look forward to. And given the scale and the pace of change that we have seen over the last few years, especially with climate, that is now starting to come into the nature narrative and the nature sort of dialogue as well, that when we look forward, there is definitely momentum. The note of caution being that we're still seeing greenwashing out in the marketplace. We're still not yet, John, to your point, we're not yet seeing that wall of capital that's often referred to. It's just not flowing yet. So we need to spend our time focusing on the whys and then use our agency to overcome those barriers and drive us to where we need to get to. But ultimately, we are living in a huge world of unbound opportunity in terms of what's possible now. And what we need are leaders to have the courage and the confidence to keep going and to be bold, and to think beyond the 1.5 degrees, the 2 degrees, to think to the 1 degree, the 0.5 degree. We need that vision, we need that creativity. And it plays to the point around, Richard, flooding in the different skill sets, thinking about the engineers, the architects, the musicians, the people who can understand, different types of code that we have at play out in society. So I think there's a lot there for people to kind of take away and unpack. And it just leaves me just to say to the three of you, thank you so much for coming and for sharing your wisdom and your insights, and for sharing a little bit of counsel as well. I hope everybody's enjoyed it. I know I certainly have. I could sit here and speak with these three for hours. Hopefully you're left in no uncertain term now that the investment opportunity for us all in finance to lean into climate and nature as two sides of the same coin, the same conversation, is there. And it's up to us now to really embrace it and drive it forward. So we hope you've enjoyed it, and we will welcome you back to the next GEFI series, Insight series. Thank you.